So my name's Alice Parkington. I am actually primarily in feminist studies and women's studies. I did my master's degree at the University of York, but have pivoted now towards heritage studies. And so my work in heritage studies has now sort of come into conversation with my father's work in archaeology. And this presentation that we're doing today is essentially a conversation between the two of us that has been ongoing about archaeology and about access in the present day. And it's a conversation that we're hoping to sort of extend to the people here today. We are happy to answer questions at the end of our presentation, but we'd really like opinions and to hear. We're basically going to set out a set of problems, and we want to hear what everyone thinks about them. And then I'll hand over to my dad to begin.
Thanks, Alice. Yeah, I think we want to pick up from yesterday and the notion of site to place. Very interesting to listen to Hugo. Maybe they were places that we didn't know about, then they became sites because we recorded them when we put them on a map. And now we're trying to get back to the idea of place. We're trying to understand a particular level of meaning. Because, of course, I think in order to understand any distribution of points on the map, you've got to know something about the people who are making the dots. These dots were made by not by essentially rock art people. They were essentially field archaeologists who largely actually through Tim Maggs and his association with us, we began to realize that it would be useful to know the distribution of different kinds of sites. So we started putting dots on maps, but they were not, all dots were not necessarily rock art sites. When we were near the coast, we found we were mapping shell middens more often than rock art sites. But of course, many of the sites had both. So we do end up with this kind of measles rash, you know, on the land, on the. But be careful. We got ourselves in a bit of a corner with this notion of that landscape is only in there because we so want to refer it to that physical thing out there. So you can see that there are some aspects of this distribution, the way it follows the streams. The closeness of some sites. We had arguments in the field as to whether we were looking at a new site or whether it was the same site, because I think the word site has really something to do with recording and with the kind of logistics. And I think what we were gradually learning as we put all these dots on the map, so that we were much more interested in the meaning behind them, the meaning of those dots. And we using the kind of literature I talked about yesterday, we developed into the position of believing that the reason for people marking these sites, and I don't have any problem with the term marking, the reason they were marking these sites was because they were caching or stashing wisdom in the landscape that they regularly used. And it became our objective to try and find out what that wisdom was and what they were doing and why they were putting particular paintings in particular places. And we did believe that there were very specific relationships. If you read Megan Beasler's work or Jose's folklore work in this area, it's quite clear that the people who were doing these paintings were clearly people who were contributing their skills to this stashing or this accumulation, and that it worked interactively. That and David's talked about this in various places, and Jeanette has talked about this as well. That in fact, once you've stashed that information, it feeds back on yourself. So topographies become landscapes. And so what happens, and people knew that these paintings were going to last a long time. We can show that from looking at repainting episodes. We can show that in many cases paintings had substantially deteriorated before they were added to, or before other paintings were put next to them or on top of them. We can show that, there's no doubt about it. The earliest dates we have, I think, in the Western Cape, perhaps would be 3,500 for the painted slabs at Steenbokfontein. So this archive has a life history. It's made by hunter-gatherers. That date predates any appearance of pastoralists in the area. It's made by hunter-gatherers who were stashing these pieces of information which they understood over many, many years, thousands of years. And obviously meanings change. So I guess the point that we would like to come back to is that this archive has a time depth. And so in terms of our question as to how we're going to manage these sites, on whose behalf are we going to try and manage them? And what do we do with the fact that the people who had the specific relationships with these images are no longer there?
So what we begin to think about then is that that these people who know things have created these caches of knowledge, and that these painted sites, these rock art sites, painted places, we argue, are places because they have meaning, and that meaning is connected to the knowledge that is within them, and that there's a recursive relationship between painting and person, in that you have these concepts of interanimation or enchantment, whereby the person paints their identity, paints their knowledge, be it about trance, be it about tradition, be it about gender identity. The painting is made onto the shelter. And by engaging with that painting later, the identity that is in the painting is reflected back onto the person who comes to view it at a later time. And so that recursive relationship makes these places, these painted places, places of identity. And that when we're looking at a map like this of rock art sites, what we're really looking at is what Beesler talks about at one point as maps to the important assets of their lives. We're looking at maps of meaning, distributed, interconnected places, and that recursive relationship that is happening between person and painting is actually also happening between paintings and other paintings. They're not rock art sites, it's a sort of rock art network where these painted places are in conversation with each other. They're reinforcing each other's meaning. And so what that brings us to is this idea of a landscape archive. And there we do have to briefly talk about the title of our talk, which is Rock Archaeve, which we're not really trying to introduce as any kind of conceptual metaphor. It's more of a sort of pun and thinking device that we were using when we were formulating what we want to say. So what we're saying now is places have meaning, that meaning is knowledge, and that means that these rock art sites, this network, is an archive. I'm going to quote Siaka, where he says, "It is hard to imagine that the prehistoric artists were unaware that the images they created would endure long after their own lives. Likewise, it is implausible that they were less self-conscious human beings who did not recognize the patrimonial worth of the previous images made on the same rock faces by their forebears and other earlier generations. This implies that these artists anticipated the prospect of their own creations of imagery, in turn forming a legacy to be passed down to and viewed by future generations long after their own existence. This may, at first, seem speculative, but to deny these people this basic human capacity is to deny them a healthy, conscious sense of their own history, their past and future, and by extension, total humanity." So what Siaka is pointing out here is that this is an archive. It matches our definitions of archives. He even quotes Derrida in his PhD thesis, saying archive is archive as accumulation and capitalization of memory on some substrate. And then we are also bringing into conversation Carolyn Hamilton saying archives and other preservatory forms are artifacts with linked practices and processes forged and continually refashioned in the crucible of ongoing social and political life. So here we're saying painted places are archives because they adhere to these functions that have been set up. They're about reckoning with past and future, painting for the future, engaging with the painting and reckoning with the past. They're about the accumulation of memory, and they're about this process of forging and refashioning identity within the context of social and political life. And so we end up in this place where we say, okay, the rock art places are a network, and that network is an archive. It's not that each cave is an archive. Each cave is almost, if we're talking about an archive, if we picture a traditional documentary archive, we see an archive, and the archive is filled with documents. The argument we're making is that the archive is the landscape, is the topography, and the documents are each painted site or painted place. And so when we think about an archive, we immediately have to think about what's missing. Because if we have some things that we do remember, what do we not have? And here we look at the 400 or more years between painting and now. We are immediately thinking about violence, colonialism, ethnocide. Where there wasn't genocide, there was ethnocide. There was the eradication of culture and cultural practices. And in the area that we're specifically focused on, which is the Achterpakke's of the Cederberg, you mainly see this form of ethnocide where hunter-gatherer people were, the language was completely eradicated. We have no trace. We don't even know what it was called. And we have people who are likely descendants of those hunter-gatherers, but they are now mostly farm laborers. And so we have painted places filled with human figures, but those human figures actually just highlight the sort of absence of those people who know, or the people now who knew. And then John remembered something he read about a Kenyan woman talking about her children who had sort of given up their traditional way of life and sort of become farmers, and she speaks about them as they have become someone else now. And that's what we have here. We have someone else, and we have to recognize that there's so little we know. We don't know the language. We don't even know the name of the people in the Achterpakke's who painted. We have the word Soakwa in Jan van Riebeck's diary, but even then, that word is a word given by the guides to Jan van Riebeck's men. So that's not there's no self-identification in that. So what we're dealing with when we're talking about our situation in the Achterpakke's is we have these painted places, we have a network, we have an archive, but we have so little in terms of local knowledge about that. We don't know the name of who painted it. We don't have the language. We have some remnants. We have the stories, as Jose de Prada Sampa has written about, but we don't have a group of people in the Achterpakke's who have self-organized and say, we identify as San people or as former hunter-gatherers. We don't have anyone who has sort of presented themselves to us, or who we've been able to find, who we can engage about this archive. Because if this is an archive, this is about questions of access. This is about whose archive is it, who gets to engage with the meaning of this archive, but even just who gets to go to it. Because the purpose of archive is that it needs to be engaged with. It's your turn now.
So for the purposes of this conference, where we've got to think about, how to manage rock art sites, I suppose the bottom line here is we don't think that you can manage rock art sites without managing the greater context in which it's sitting, because the people who painted it are not there. It's not only that they are someone else now, the landscape is something else now. It's become a farming landscape. It's become a fenced landscape. All kinds of things have changed. And so I think what we want to end with is the idea that you can't manage the rock art in isolation, not even in isolation from the rest of the archaeological record, but it has to be situated in the kind of history of events that have overtaken. And that means that it will be different in different places. Obviously, there's no one size fits all here. There are a few in our Achterpakkers area. There are a few examples of institutions or organizations or people or groups who are taking advantage of, if you like, managing the rock art. There's the Bushman's Kloof, highly capitalist operation, who are very controlling, very protective. The rock art there is absolutely safe because they've got a lot of money resting on it, and they look after it. But for whom? There's a Sevilla trail next door, which many of you know, and that is slightly different. It benefits a slightly different groups of people, and but there are many people whom it doesn't benefit. Living Landscape operated there.
Just to add to that, we're also thinking about the fact that both Bushman's Kloof and the Sevilla Trail, very interestingly, next door to each other, with very different price points, but both have very little engagement with any local people in terms of local people's relationship to the rock art. They're not interested in asking local people what they think about it or putting the profits of their capitalist venture back into local people from whom that land was taken.
It's kind of an irony, really, that the more evidence there is of concern about local people or descendant communities, the less profitable it's likely to be, and the more difficult it is going to be to maintain those initiatives.
And another thing that we're sort of thinking about, one of the sort of like thinking points we had was Lascaux to Australia, right? So when we're thinking about Lascaux, there's no engagement with local Indigenous people because there's so much time separating then and now. And so there's little need for considerations of like who guides you to, you can't go, but but who gets to go in, who's local enough. Although I did really enjoy Dr. Ndlovu's he said something at a conference I went to where he was talking about Lascaux for future generations, and Doc, you said, me, I am a future generation. Why can't I go? You know, like that kind of question. But and then we have something like Australia, where there's a really strong connection with rock art and Indigenous people, and so there's the spectrum of connections to rock art sites and to there's a spectrum of sort of obligation to local communities. Do you want to speak about the Living Landscape then?
So Living Landscape was an attempt to build a relationship between the past, as we archaeologists had been recording it, and current communities. And there are various opinions about the Living Landscape. I lived it for 20 years, and I think we had a lot of success. But I could see that there were some components of that initiative that were not going to work. I'm not sufficient of a business person, so as long as I was raising money and feeding it through, it seemed to work. But when that became more difficult, it the project became more difficult to sustain. I do think we had a lot of achievements. And I work with Jeanette a lot on this. Jeanette raised funds and brought the funds to Clanwilliam. We did a lot of training of local people as guides, and some of those people are still guiding. And we did a lot of work in schools. I mean, thousands of school children visited sites that they probably wouldn't otherwise have. I think we did have quite a substantial impact, but I'm not sure it's and all of these attempts are locally designed, as it were, for local circumstances. Worked for a while, but and I'm very proud of people like David and John and others who have managed to earn their living from guiding, and of course Bushman's Cliff, Blondie, yeah, they've done really well. And I don't know how you measure the success of one of these projects, but there were some successes. Thank you.
Alors, before to give the mic, I will start with a question, and also linked with what we heard yesterday afternoon, but this question of a landscape and how to approach landscape, and how helpful, and I think also Leah, she will be able to answer, how helpful can be the geographic information system also to approach this question of a WorldCat landscape. If you have some answer to give us about that, if you have think about that, and perhaps Leah, you can complete, because her PhD was on this subject also, how this new technology can help to approach WorldCat as landscape.
Yeah, well, and Nick might be the best person to answer this, because our archive started out very, putting a dot on a map. In fact, right at the beginning, we were literally putting a dot on a 1 in 50,000 map. That's where the site is. There was no GPS available, But gradually, we took advantage of increasing technology, and eventually Nick did a fantastic job, which maybe you'd like to say something about, which is transforming. Doing the presentation on it. Oh, okay, sorry, Nick. Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah. But obviously, we try to go with the technology, but an interesting question would be: to what extent does that get us to place? To what extent does that just improve space? To what extent does all of this technology just help us know where things are rather than what they meant to people?
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, sorry. Sorry, I'm a bit put under the spotlight. I wasn't ready to ask a question, to speak. But for me, yeah, the GIS, it was more like a tool for me as a scientist to take a step back and to be able to visualize the rock art sites in the space, and to realize what their relationship could be between them, and like for example, can what we defined as sites, like just a boulder, how could they be seen from each other, or could we maybe hear from one site to another, how close are they, and to thinking about the sites as boulders in terms of network. And maybe I realize maybe a site is not just a boulder, but maybe this relationship between all the what we call sites.
Yeah, sorry, I don't. Maybe I'm misjudging the potential. What we have been doing is doing a lot of scanning of sites, and using drone imagery and so on to try and locate, to try and present not just the site, but a landscape level, or the beginnings of a landscape level presentation of where paintings are, what else is in the area, and what we've been doing through Jose and Alice is interviewing local people with stories that relate to that same landscape, stories that people tell today. So we've been trying to embed all of these stories. We've embedded some archaeologists talking about paintings. We've embedded older people in the community. We've embedded the rock art locations. We've included three-dimensional laser scan models of the. We're trying to use the technology to achieve the purpose of showing landscape rather than sight.
Thank you, John and Alice. Just a question about your conceptualization of place as archives, as memorials. I'm wondering what this would look like if you were to partly draw from local or indigenous ideas and associations to land and landscapes. And of course, it would change over time. But beyond Derrida and Hamilton, who I respect, wouldn't we learn much more by going to, at least trying to excavate those notions of connections to land and landscape drawn from local forms of knowledge? Thank you.
So I think that there's, when you say local forms of knowledge, I assume you literally mean local and not related to any kind of hunter-gatherer ontology. But that is the work that we are doing with Jose. A lot of it is about saying, it's about sort of like understanding relationships to place. And a lot of that relationship to place is about understanding relationships to the landscape. I remember there was a moment when Andries said to us that the river had flooded that year because of something someone had done wrong. Someone had built a dam or used the water on their farm incorrectly. And we have other stories about where we're literally following someone through the landscape with a little video recorder and listening to them tell stories about place. And what we can see from those stories about place is that it is about movement between places as much as it is about one particular place. A lot of the stories are about what it means to move between places.
It's me now. It's just a comment actually on one thing you said, and you saw me ticking, I'm pretty sure actually. I'm going to be a bit provocative. I'm sorry about that. But when you mentioned Lascaux, you said that indeed there was non-local indigenous. That's exactly the words you used. True from the Stone Age point of view. That's absolutely true. But on the other hand, I can tell you that I'm considering myself as a local indigenous. I was born and raised near Lascaux, like my family. So from the French point of view, historical depth point of view, I can be considered as a local indigenous. Of course, I have no idea about the meanings of the paintings or whatever. But look, I'm so attached and engaged with it that I've become a rock art specialist. So that's a strong feeling. But my point is, we do, as locals, have attachments, have memories, individual and collective. We do even have folk tales, actually, related to some of the rock art places and so on and so forth. And even though all this local knowledge is completely left aside, the official disseminated knowledge around all these places. And Lascaux, I'm kind of angry actually against Lascaux because they put, I don't know how many millions of euros for that thing. And it's beautiful. I mean, the copy is just astonishing and everything. But the knowledge you get disseminated is only the official archaeological knowledge, which is fine. I mean, but it's only one of the other knowledges that can be relevant and interesting to be shared as a universal value. That's my point. So your concern here in Southern Africa about how to deal with the different indigenous knowledge systems regarding to these spaces, in a kind of way, we are also facing this type of struggle in the European context. That was my comment.
And I think that's exactly why we sort of want to be having this conversation, because that shows us that perhaps there is no removing something from the context that it lives in, from the people that live around it, from the people who are related to it, from the people that it impacts. Perhaps we're actually incorrect to think about it like that, and we have to think about all rock art places as being contextual and as having maybe not indigenous, but as you say, like local people who have a relationship to it, and we need to consider that relationship in different ways, and we need to be open to different types of relationship that are existing.
Last question.
So from the idea about the working with local people or descendant communities in different countries, I think is quite interesting, because different histories in all the different countries. So you also mentioned Australia, and I'm thinking about, you're speaking about France, but I'm also thinking about South Africa, and how it's been quite a brutal and violent history for a lot of communities. So when do you think about the trauma, and are you perhaps, does trauma come out when you're speaking to a lot of these communities? So I know with the people I work with in the Kalahari, traumas in everyday life all the time. Do people get particularly upset when they're talking about some of these histories or experiences? I know they probably can't remember directly, but a lot of people will be aware of how their present condition has been affected by what has happened in the past. And part of that is also related to rock art and how people have moved and where their descendants are and where their descendants killed in genocides and things like that. Does that come out ever in your interactions?
Not often. There's not a lot of we don't see a lot of that emotion, and that could very likely be because we're not a safe person for those people to express that trauma to or to discuss it with. But it is definitely something that we are considering when we're having these conversations. And they're obviously very carefully crafted conversations to guide someone through if they are talking about something difficult, to try and in gender studies, they talk about like closing the gate at the end of an interview to try and wrap things up correctly. One of the other things that we're also quite conscious of is not causing future trauma, right? So one of the things we are worried about is, what does it mean if we get involved and start talking to everyone and start encouraging local people to have a particular type of relationship to the rock art, which is a good thing. Do we have a responsibility to do so in such a way and be mindful of the fact that if local people start organizing themselves, they are a step closer to making a land claim, which they should be able to do. But does that put them in any type of danger in relation to landowners? Are there risks that we need to be considering in that respect? Are there ways that we need to be, you know what I mean? Are there things that we need to be doing there to make sure that if those things are happening, which they should, they're happening in a way that the people involved are protected? And by that, I mean the local people, not the farm owners.